The Enlightenment, or Age of Light, refers to the belief that the musty old ideas needed to be exposed to the light of rational investigation to see if they were still valuable. The bright light of reason needed to shine on tradition. And this momentous challenge to tradition came about during a time in which Europe was being completely transformed in many ways that are sometimes forgotten amid all the excitement about Voltaire and reason. So let's go straight to the thought bubble today. Beyond the wars and state building we've already seen, increasing abundance and novelty was creeping into the everyday lives of Europeans. Coffee, tea, chocolate, tobacco, and other commodities led to experimentation. For instance, one English housewife saw tea for the first time and thought it was meant to be baked as a kind of pie filling. A diplomat said that tea and coffee had brought a greater sobriety and civility to everyday life in Europe. Europe had previously been a land of famine and mere subsistence for essentially all of its history, but now the cultivation of new foods from the Americas, like potatoes and corn, along with literally thousands of other new plants, meant that available calories were increasing, and it also introduced the idea that maybe the world didn't have to be perpetually on the brink of starvation and catastrophe. Also, by this time, tens of thousands of Europeans had traveled the world and had experienced other social orders firsthand. For instance, travelers discovered that people across Asia didn't seem as quarrelsome as Europeans. Drivers of carts didn't block narrow streets for hours arguing over who had the right of way. They politely agreed to let one or the other pass. They also saw that not all social orders were as hierarchical as most European ones, and that some societies even gave less weight to a person's parentage and more to a person's individual skills and talents. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So one of the first ways writers criticized outmoded ways of life was to make fun of them. Writers like Charles Louis de Secondant Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu, aka just Montesquieu. He really was the proper person to criticize outmoded ways of life because boy did he have an outmoded name. Montesquieu was a jurist who owned an estate near Bordeaux, which by the way still makes wine under his name, and in 1721 he published the Persian Letters, in which Uzbek visitors find Europe amusing, if not shocking. The visitors, for instance, are amazed at the magic of priests who somehow perform the trick of turning wine into blood. And although they clearly see the problems in French society, they also firmly adhere to the mustiness of their old ways, such as keeping women secluded in a harem guarded by eunuchs. The message was that both Easterners and Europeans were imperfect. To replace the old stuffy ways of monarchs and priests and aristocrats telling us that we were already living in a perfect world, people needed to learn how to embrace the newly desirable traits of the Enlightenment, like being honest and inquisitive and open. Swiss thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau had many ideas about education reform, for instance. He wasn't a wealthy or titled person, but rather was born into a watchmaking family and lived among artisans. His best-selling novel, Emile, describes a boy who grows up not in a city or a palace, but in a countryside where one can be oneself, a natural individual. Instead of experiencing common rote learning with large doses of religious and classical reading, Emile learns carpentry and gardening and other practical skills. In the countryside, he behaves in what Rousseau saw as the best possible way, naturally and without pretentious airs. Rousseau promoted what would come to be called middle-class values, like hard work, practicality, and domesticity for women. When Emile becomes a young man, the spouse chosen for him is plump and smiling and devoted to taking care of him, not studying or reading or practicing a craft or working hard to support the family like farm women did. Also, she will breastfeed their children, whereas both aristocratic women and busy working women at the time commonly used wet nurses. And as with Emile's upbringing, all of this is presented as natural. Meanwhile, wealthy women in Europe instituted the Enlightenment Salon, regular get-togethers in their homes to hear the latest idea, learn about the latest book, or meet the latest philosopher-influencer, called a philosophe in French. In general, Enlightenment aims were more worldly than spiritual. In Scotland, philosopher David Hume promoted reason above religion, concluding that belief in God was mere superstition. Some people, called deists, argued that God existed, but that he didn't have influence on everyday life after having set in motion the machinery of the universe. Many important founding fathers in the United States were deists, and if you believe, as many philosophers did, that God keeps a distance from human affairs, then the persecution of people for their religious beliefs starts to seem like cruel fanaticism. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant's attention to individual reason. He famously exclaimed, "Dare to know," as he advanced the Enlightenment's commitment to the human mind and the ability of every person to think for themselves instead of simply obeying old commands and ideas. The human mind, he argued, housed categories of understanding with which information interacted to produce purely rational judgments. And in this way, we can trace our own culture's emphasis on individualism back to the Enlightenment. And many other individuals took refuge in Enlightenment thought, as well as taking it as a call to action. Upper-class Jewish women across Europe found the world of ideas so inspiring that they began salons too. In Berlin, for instance, they established 9 of the 14 salons in the city. And philosopher and author Moses Mendelssohn used the more tolerant atmosphere to express his optimism about the future of Jews in Europe. Because of the Enlightenment emphasis on reason, he believed that the age-old persecution of Jewish people would soon end. Of course, we know now that wasn't the case, and that much exploitation and oppression has taken place under the guise of reasoned thought. Pseudoscientific reason has been used to justify many forms of structural inequality, from racism to sexism to class systems. Rationality would not prove to be a way out of the human urge to create and marginalize outsiders. But Enlightenment thought was nonetheless transformative, and seeking worldly explanations for inequality and injustice did have significant real-world consequences. I mean, no longer would we see earthquakes merely as acts of God. Enlightenment challenges to the idea that we were already living in the best of all possible worlds would also help us to imagine and eventually to live in better worlds, albeit ones that are still profoundly imperfect. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching Crash Course, which is made by all of these nice people and filmed here in the Jaden Smith Studios in Indianapolis. Huge thanks, as always, to our animators at Thought Cafe. Also, we've got lots of other Crash Course for you, including our video about Candide, so check that out. Thanks again for watching, and don't forget to be awesome.
It seems at first weird that we might learn from Thomas Aquinas. He was a medieval saint who was reputed to have levitated and had visions of the Virgin Mary. He was much concerned with explaining how angels speak and move. And yet, he continues to matter because he helps us with a problem which continues to bedevil us: how we can reconcile religion with science and faith with reason. Aquinas was both a philosopher and a saint. Refusing either to lose his faith or mindlessly believe, he developed a new understanding of the place of reason in human life. Aquinas' monumental contribution was to teach Western European civilization that any human being, not just a Christian, could have access to great truths whenever they made use of God's greatest gift to human beings, reason. Aquinas broke a logjam in Christian thinking, the question of how non-Christians could have both wisdom and at the same time no interest in or even knowledge of Jesus. Aquinas universalized intelligence. He opened the Christian mind to the insights of all of humanity from across the ages and the continents. The modern world, insofar as it insists that good ideas can come from any quarter, regardless of creed or background, remains hugely in Aquinas' debt. Thomas Aquinas was born to a noble family in Italy in 1225. As a young man, he went to study at the University of Naples, and there came into contact with a source of knowledge which was just then being rediscovered: the texts of ancient Greek and Roman authors. Aquinas then became an academic at the University of Paris and an exceptionally prolific writer, producing nearly 200 pieces about Christian theology in less than 3 decades. His books bear beautiful and strange titles like the Summa Theologica and Summa Contra Gentiles. Such was his devotion to knowledge, Even at the moment of his death, at the age of 49, Aquinas is reputed to have been in the middle of writing an extended commentary on the Song of Songs. After he died, he was canonized in the Catholic Church and is now the patron saint of teachers. Aquinas' starting point was that some of the world's greatest thinkers have not been Christian, but this didn't bar them from having huge insights, because, as Aquinas proposed, the world can be usefully explored through reason and not just through faith. To explain how this could work, Aquinas brilliantly proposed that the universe and all its dynamics operate according to two kinds of law: secular natural law and religious eternal law. For Aquinas, a lot of the world follows natural laws. We can find out for ourselves how to smelt iron, build an aqueduct, or organize an economy, and none of this relies on believing in God. Aquinas discussed Jesus' injunction to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Jesus may have given this idea a particularly memorable formulation, conceded Aquinas, but it's in fact been a cornerstone of moral principles in most societies at most times. How could this be possible? Well, the reason, Aquinas argued, is that it's an idea that belongs to natural and not eternal law. Aquinas conceded that in a few situations, God does work simply through eternal law outside of human reason, and he cited prophetic revelations and the visits of angels as examples. However, he reassured us that most useful knowledge can be found by atheists and secular-minded people within the realm of natural law. Aquinas' ideas unfolded at a time when Islamic culture was going through very similar dilemmas as Christianity in terms of how one can reconcile reason and faith. For a long time, the Islamic caliphates in Spain, Morocco, and Egypt had flourished by being open to knowledge from all over the world, generating a wealth of new scientific ideas and philosophy. However, due to the increasing influence of fanatical religious leaders, Islam had become more dogmatic and oppressive by the time Aquinas was born. It had, for example, reacted violently against the Muslim philosopher Averroes. Like Aquinas, Averroes had been deeply influenced by Aristotle and had argued that reason and religion could be compatible. However, the caliphates, anxious never to depart from the literal words of God, made sure that Averroes' ideas would be banned and his books burned. Aquinas knew that the Muslim world's increasingly radical rejection of reason was harming what had once been its thriving intellectual culture, and it was overwhelmingly thanks to Aquinas' ideas that Christianity did not suffer the same process of stultification. Though Aquinas was a man of deep faith, he provided a philosophical framework for open scientific inquiry. He reminds us that knowledge can and should come from multiple sources, from intuition but also from rationality, from science but also from revelation, from pagans but also from monks. That sounds obvious until we notice just how often civilization has been and is still being harmed by people's refusal to take this brilliant idea on board.
But here you and I are talking to each other. Well, thank God for the Enlightenment. I mean, thank God for the rise of the modern sciences that have enabled us to live infinitely more comfortably and successfully within the world. Our ancestors, not that many generations ago, were spending almost their entire day barely trying to survive.
When discussing the effects of the Enlightenment today, you've often highlighted how those two streams of the scientific revolution and then the political revolutions led today to things like scientism or the sort of culture of self-invention. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, and so on purpose, I was trying to get very lyrical and very effusive in my praise of the Enlightenment, and I mean every word of it. And I wouldn't want to gainsay any of it. Okay, so I hope that's super clear to people. But as you suggest, you know, it's Karl Barth's line I always remember is, "See the moon in yonder sky, 'tis only half that meets the eye." I mean, or Carl Jung that would say, the brighter the light, often the darker the shadow that's cast. Right? If you have the bright light shining on something, and that's the enlightenment, right? Light. Aufklärung in German, and it's the Le siècle des Lumières in French, the century of lights. You know, light is great. I love light, but the brighter the light, often the darker the shadow. Okay, and the two ways that you put it there is what I've argued. We love the sciences, but we don't like scientism, and that's a shadow of the Enlightenment, namely the reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. What's real and true is now reduced to what we can know and control through the scientific method. Now, look, long time ago, not just today, but long time ago, to early critics of the Enlightenment, people like Goethe in Germany, making exactly that argument. We stumble when we get so enthusiastic about the sciences that we overlook non-scientific but altogether rational ways of knowing. When we tend to marginalize or bracket or reduce the arts, the humanities, poetry, literature, philosophy, religion, maybe above all. What's often the great target of Enlightenment enthusiasm, epistemically speaking? Religion, right? We got to overcome these old, superstitions. That's a shadow side of the Enlightenment. We want to approve everything that's positive about it, but also caution and over-enthusiasm in the direction of scientism. And then, as you say, what's the shadow side of the great move toward liberation and political freedom? Freedom and equality, you might say, are the two great values of the political Enlightenment, right? And for a lot of people in our country, that's what politics is about, is increasing freedom and equality. Okay, good, both of them. But what's the limit? The limit is I so valorize freedom and equality that I become the arbiter of good and evil. I'm free to determine who I am. I'm free to determine the meaning of my life. I'm free to determine all moral value. And don't press me because we're all equal. Don't tell me your view is better than mine. Don't tell me that I can't express what I, am feeling. That's the culture of self-invention, which I think is freedom and equality run amok. It's the legitimate expression of the Enlightenment politically, but now pressed to an extreme.
I think for me, the two most glaring omissions are morality and religion. Yeah. Like, how are we faring by those two criteria? Because today, we've talked so many times about the religious dwindling in the West, the rise of the nuns, and then by moral metrics, would we be able to say that today in the 21st century, by and large, we're a more morally healthy culture than, say, the 16th, 15th, 14th centuries? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And see, another face of scientism is we so buy into the scientistic sort of take on things that we think of knowledge as, it moves up like this. You go from, the ancients and the Ptolemy, and then you advance it, then Galileo, and then Newton, and everything just keeps getting better and better, clearer and clearer. I'm not going to go back to Ptolemy to figure out how the planets are situated. I'm going to look at the latest science. Fine, that's true when it comes to the physical sciences. But is it true, for example, that the poetry written today is necessarily better than T.S. Eliot or than Dante or than Homer? I mean, give me a break. Or that we see things with greater moral clarity today than Thomas Aquinas did or than Plato did? I mean, by no means. That our political, philosophical perspective is necessarily better than what Plato had. Well, you can debate that, but we succumb to a sort of scientistic prejudice when it comes to the advance of knowledge. There's a lot more to life than what the Enlightenment illumines and delivers.
The power of age and intellect is finite. Human beings can know and understand the truth up to a point, in a limited way. Perhaps it's best to say we can catch a glimpse of the truth of things. Since the power of our age and intellect is finite, we are in no way omniscient or able to be omniscient or comprehend all things. We must humbly accept the gift of a finite light and use it with awareness of our limits.
All you have to do is humble yourself before the presence of the Lord, admit There are things greater than you in the universe that you do not understand, and salvation awaits you. Take Pascal's wager. If you're wrong,
Gets
you're
it
an
slightly
idiot.
wrong.
But if I'm right, you're going to hell.
I do admit there are things in the universe I don't understand.
Okay.
But my response to that is not to make up silly stories.
They're pretty good stories. Some of them are pretty good stories,
Or
Bill.
to believe intellectually embarrassing myths from the Bronze Age, but you believe whatever you want.